Our guest today is Asad Ramzanali, Director of AI and Tech Policy at the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Today, we're doing a deep dive on AI and policy. What are the conceptual foundations? What are some risk governance models? How do we measure and evaluate what's going on? How do we create accountability about problems with AI? How do we make sure we maintain democratic legitimacy and trust? And then talk a little bit about his future research agenda. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone. It's Alec Crawford, your host for the AI Risk Reward podcast. And our special guest today is Asad Ramzanali, Director of AI and Tech Policy at the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Welcome, Asad.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be exciting. So I'm excited to do a deep dive on policy around AI. Obviously, all kinds of stuff going on around the globe with AI, and maybe a little less going on with AI policy. But first, tell us a little bit about what's the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator?
Yeah. So the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator is a research center at Vanderbilt University that focuses on issues relating to regulation and the political economy. My job there as the Director of AI and Tech Policy is to think about public policy in the whole span of everything from research policy issues to regulatory questions to competition and antitrust issues. So the whole kind of life cycle of how we get technologies and how we govern them as a society.
Yeah, look, such an important question. And I think, a lot of politicians feel like, oops, we kind of missed the boat with social media. And obviously we don't want to miss the boat with AI, because instead of just having a bad evening or not enough followers, it could be like a Terminator movie or something, right? So maybe not that bad, but well, let's start with conceptual foundations. How do you define artificial intelligence risk within contemporary policy discourse at this point? What kind of frameworks should we be thinking about there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So AI is a general purpose technology. It's a set of technologies. It's not a singular thing. And even the fundamental definition of AI in laws and frameworks that we have is such that you have to be really careful for the specific use case and the specific issue you're working on to define it properly. Often my starting point is it's not actually useful to go down to a technical level of, do we mean generative AI in this specific thing with large language models or reasoning? It's more, let's start broader and then narrow into, do we actually mean something smaller? Because it's easier to miss something than it is to kind of catch it in a expanding sense. In one of the ways you talked about it is policymakers feeling like they missed the boat with social media. I think that's accurate to some degree. And there is a little bit of, well, depending on what we're talking about, if we're working on AI policy, it actually would be odd for it to apply narrowly to generative AI and not to a broader set of technologies that have the same implications. And, oh, by the way, social media employs a lot of AI, not just the slop that we see now, but also the sorting algorithms and the AI networks or the ad networks and everything behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I think it's also important. There are probably different risk frameworks and policies that we need for different things. So, for example, there's systemic risk. Right? A bunch of banks adopt AI, and that could, be a problem for the payment system. There's model level risk, and a lot of that is showing up in certain rules and laws. And it's like, okay, look, if you make base models and you make tons of money, we need to know what's going on, right? Because lots of people are using them. And then there's also deployment level risks at, let's say, regulated entities like banks or insurance companies. And to some degree, there is the whole like, hey, just because it's AI doesn't mean it doesn't apply. Like, hey, these existing rules for fair lending and various anti-bias, things like that, all still exist and apply for AI. And one of the red things the regulators want is like, well, who's responsible? Who's responsible for this AI? If there's a problem, we need to know who to go to, because we're not going to a computer, right? So that's one piece of the puzzle. But this whole like systemic model level, deployment level, is that how the regulators are currently thinking about it? Or is this something they're going to need to pivot to, because these are so different than kind of prior effort?
Yeah. So because it's a general purpose technology and its uses are so broad, the way to think about it is where does it show up? So when you said, is that the way regulators think about it? Well, which regulators do you mean, right? There's a whole set of financial regulators who think about it in some of the ways you described. The FDA thinks about AI as it shows up in medical devices. The FCC thinks about AI and how it shows up in spectrum management for cell sites and for robocalls and for a whole host of other things. So it's the kind of thing where I think about where we have sectoral regulations or regulatory agencies, the federal or state level. Almost all of them will have some reason to be thinking about how AI shows up in their world, and we will need to think about the new risks that are either new to AI or newly exacerbated because of AI. And so that's where my mind goes to. I don't start necessarily at the model level of like, what's the risk of a model? There are some inherent to the model level, or sometimes people we want to talk about the chip level. Those national security concerns I put in one bucket of when we talk about existential risk or national security risks. There's a set of things I do worry about, and we should be serious about those. The answer for a lot of those right now looks like either transparency or look at other points of the supply chain of the problem holistically and not just the AI intervention. So when we talk about biological weapons risk, for example, I'm not as confident that the answer is to edit models to be less risky, but the answer might be to, when those models are used in a way that develops tests using actual biological materials, to regulate how those are bought and sold, right? That's one example. But the new risks that AI either creates new or exacerbates in new ways are actually really big for society. And that's how we have to think about, in a broader sense, what to do about them. So one example that Congress recently took action on is the example of non-consensual intimate imagery. Sometimes it's called revenge pornography. Deepfake nudes is another term that's used. NCII, the formal name, that's a real problem with real victims, and there's thousands of people who are harmed by it. Congress recently passed a law to deal with that. It's not going to be complete. It's not going to solve the problem completely, but it's one way to govern the issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Look, I think one of the issues for the base model providers, these are the really big companies providing huge models. It's also, some of those are open source, right? So if I'm a bad guy and I have an open source model and I stick it on a server, in my bad guy cave and unplug from the internet, I can do pretty much whatever I want at that point, and no one knows what I'm doing. So I think the issue is going to remain that these models are creating risks of really allowing people to do things that are bad they had zero capability to do before the advent of large language models. So, time will tell. It's difficult to regulate those because you would need global regulation. Like, I can download a model from China just as easily as I can download one from the U.S. So just having the guardrails in the U.S., it's going to help, but it doesn't completely help, unfortunately.
Yeah, but that's also where there is no such thing as a regulation that completely solves every problem, right? Like all regulations come with some degree of trade-off. We try our best in especially risky or harmful scenarios to be over-covered on how much we can get done. But you're right, this is a set of technologies, and it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And the kinds of risks we worry about differ by domain, but also by kind of technology involved.
Yeah, I agree. So shifting gears to risk governance and AI governance, super important topic right now. So what are the comparative strengths and weaknesses of a centralized model of kind of AI governance versus distributed models? So that might be federal government versus the states. Obviously right now we're seeing this play out to some degree with the federal government saying, hey, we don't want the states making these rules. They're just mucking things up. And obviously the big companies, whether it's big banks or big model providers, like, oh my God, we can't possibly comply with 50 sets of rules. But there doesn't really seem to be a set of kind of risk guidelines or AI governance guidelines out there on the federal level either. There is in Europe a little bit, and it's coming. So how do we think about that?
So I don't think there is going to be here's the answer, right? Here is the AI law that solves all the problems we have. I don't think even the European AI Act aims to do that in any, exact, complete way. In our system of federalized lawmaking, where you have federal and state, and now the city of New York has some laws relating to employment in AI. All of the concerns you just laid out that industry has are very real. And I don't think we're changing our system of federalized lawmaking. So the example I gave earlier of the Take It Down Act, where Congress acted on deepfake nudes, that happened after, I think it was 2/3 of states had some law dealing with that exact issue. So where those laws conflict, where the federal and state law conflict, now the federal law governs because that's how our Constitution works. But at the end of the day, states have been more nimble to deal with the risks and harms that they see. I think it's reasonable for federal lawmakers to say we want a federal standard in this one area. Call it employment, call it, there's a lot of questions of how your voice and likeness are used, and the state of Tennessee passed the Elvis Act. There's a federal analog that's been proposed. That's a reasonable place for Congress to say we want this to apply more broadly. And that would preempt state laws if it conflicts or if it sets the standard. That's reasonable to do issue by issue. It's harder for me to see we have this new general purpose technology. Even the two of us who study this thing, who look at it closely, can't sit here and define all of the ways it impacts society. So it'd be kind of hard to say you can't have any laws at the state level. And oh, by the way, Congress hasn't been too active on tech policy issues. So we're not going to be able to govern it much at all and minimize the risks that I think are a responsible thing to do.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So moving on to measurement and evaluation, what methodologies do you consider most robust for assessing AI risks ex ante, especially in contexts where empirical evidence might be limited, or in this case, models are rapidly evolving. I'm seeing new models come out literally every week. And by the way, models that were top of line a year ago are being deprecated and literally taken off the market. You can't use them anymore.
Yep. So for general purpose models, the foundation models, the large language models, and even some of the multimodal models that we're seeing, we've had a really difficult time figuring out how to think about benchmarks and metrics, even for just, does this thing perform the way it says it does? And so that's why you see a lot of the conversation being driven by what companies release themselves in their white papers and other things with the model. Usually we don't rely on companies to tell us how good something is. You want a third-party evaluator, you want an independent audit. So that space continues to evolve. One example of a type of AI that isn't today's AI, where we actually did this well, is facial recognition. I have lots of concerns with how facial recognition is used, but the development of the testing methodologies to determine how good a system is have evolved quite a bit. Far from perfect, but NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's part of the Commerce Department. It's a federal agency that is a government lab. They have a system where a couple times a year, they do a call for models, and you can submit your facial recognition model through a whole technical process they have where they give you guardrails for competitive information and for a bunch of things. And the agreement is if you submit something, they're going to publish how you did publicly. It's a voluntary system, but that system has gotten better over time at understanding bias, at understanding what lighting means, what all the different technical aspects of this are. But that's a narrow, specific use case where NIST has developed a methodology. I could imagine getting there with foundation models. We will have to define a set of outcomes we care about. All of that said, for general models, there's a much easier answer when it comes to something like financial services. Much easier connotes that it's actually easy. I just mean it's in a relative sense easier. It can still be really hard. But we have a sense of how to test for lending algorithms, for example, where we understand outcomes and what they look like from a disparate impact standpoint. So there's more development there where you're looking at a specific use case.
Yeah, that makes sense. look, one of my concerns is when I see new models come out and do amazing on these predefined tests, like humanity's last exam,
Mhm.
guess what's going on behind the scenes? It's like basically given someone the SAT answer key. Wow, look how great they're doing at the SAT, right? So I think that's to some degree what's going on. And if you could
Totally.
off the reservation there and ask a brand new question, it may not be quite as good. So we do have to be cautious about, these tests, right? When in data science, you always reserve
That's right.
some of your data, to test the model like out of sample, and that's basically not happening. Right?
And that's what the facial recognition vendor test tries to do, is use examples of photos that there's a high probability are not in the training set. The government can do that, right? Like and there's a lot of controversy, and I buy a lot of criticisms of whether that's, how we get that data. All those questions are real. I think you're right, and I think there's good faith reasons for some of that confusion of, hey, we did really well on the LSAT or a mathematical Olympiad or humanities, any of the exams we're talking about. There's good faith confusion on how these systems are trained. The engineers don't have a complete sense of all of the training data that goes into it and what that's inclusive of, because so many of these sets of data are sets themselves of many data sets. And when you think about crawling the entire internet using something like Common Crawl, you can't conceivably know everything that's in that. And then there's some bad faith ones where even after we have seen the examples of where those benchmarks are actually done in ways that are just poor methodologies, companies and others continue to use them. And that's where I get a little bit more skeptical of like, all right, we've actually adjudicated this and there's kind of technical agreement that this is a bad benchmark. But if we keep using it, you're not only like building to the test, you're building to the wrong test.
Yeah, that's not great. I agree. So what's the process look like? Let's say there was political and public will to create some risk management safety tests for the big base models. How does that go from there to it's like you were talking about this NIST, facial recognition test to something there? Like, what's the process look like for that to happen?
So there's a formal kind of policy answer I'll give you there, but one thing I'll add before that is I tend to think about things like testing and transparency requirements in one bucket of necessary but wildly insufficient. I tend to start with what harms are we seeing, what harms can we reasonably conceive of, and we should have more direct regulatory or public policy interventions that deal with those. So if we see a specific discriminatory harm, banning that might be better than going 7 steps into testing methodology, determining the root cause of it, saying you can't do this thing, or trying to adjust that with a little knob here or there indirectly, rather than letting companies determine how to figure that out or understand that they're on the hook for a problem like that, which is what we do in a lot of other regulatory scenarios, right? We maintain liability standards. We go after kind of more direct, this is a bad business practice, we're going to ban it. But to answer your question, we do need to do all that. We do need transparency, which has been a real, it's been a fight at the state level where states have required transparency. California has a law, Colorado has a law, though it's not in effect yet. And that's been a real back and forth with a lot of industry actors saying that those are onerous. I read the text of those laws and I don't think they are. I just don't. I get the idea that 50 different versions of that would be onerous, but we're actually nowhere near 50 different versions of it. In fact, New York's version of it is almost identical to the California version. And so that's where my mind goes to, like, I get the theory of the concern. I just don't see evidence that we're there or getting there. And if we got anywhere near that, that's a great time for a federal standard to standardize it.
Yeah.
That's imperfect. Sometimes we don't get there. To answer your question on how we would get there for like a generalized testing regime for foundation models, Congress could pass a law that says, here's what NIST needs to do, design a test, here's the things we care about at a very high level, at a principles level, Or at a granular level, maybe they say, we want to make sure that this doesn't have discriminatory impact in these specific domains or in traditional civil rights areas. NIST would then go through a process. They're pretty good at operating in a multi-stakeholder way. So they would put out a bunch of different working groups to figure out how this would work. And then they would get funding to operationalize the thing. It would be a digital lab that actually takes in a set of AI algorithms, manages them, puts them on the right kinds of infrastructure you need. That could be everything from like air-gapped computers if we have certain kinds of concerns, to specialized chips because you actually want to test it on the right kind of infrastructure, and then run it through a set of testing.
And now a word from our sponsor. Artificial Intelligence Risk Inc. accelerates adoption of GenAI safely. They provide the governance, risk, compliance, and cybersecurity platform that financial, healthcare, and other regulated organizations need before they can use GenAI safely and in compliance with regulatory requirements. Their software has won #1 awards for cybersecurity and compliance from Waters Technology. Find them at aicrisk.com. Absolutely. No, that sounds great. That's very helpful. Now, look, the big thing going on here, the subtext is regulation versus innovation, right? So very clear why all these companies saying, no, don't do it, right? It's about they want to run as fast as they possibly can. They think they're in a race with each other for AGI, and they're claiming they're in a race with China.
That's right.
Right? Because they think it's a kind of a winner-takes-all thing. I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not sure I believe that we're super close to AGI, although we'll probably have something that fools people pretty soon. It may not be conscious. It may not be artificial general intelligence, but yeah, we were fooling Google engineers, last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my God, my chatbot loves me kind of stuff, right? So let's think about that a bit. What are the big trade-offs there, and how should we be thinking about that the right way?
So a few things there. I share your skepticism, and I probably have deeper, more extreme versions of it, including that I don't think AGI exists. I think it's a false oasis that we always put a little bit further out than we are right now. And I don't think it exists at a technical level, but I also don't think it's helpful as a framework or as a kind of just like architect or as an artifact of how we describe these things. Like, what does it mean if we achieve it? And like, does that actually change anything day to day? The companies are certainly in a race with each other, and that's why laws would impact all of them, and I'm okay with that. The idea of over-regulating versus the right balance or what that looks like, I am of the view that if that's a pendulum and maybe you can never quite get to the middle, I'm of the view that we're so far from over-regulating. We can't see what over-regulating even looks like from where we are today. I don't know of a technologist who has said, I'm not going to build that because of the regulations involved in AI. Never heard that. In fact, all I know of is we literally don't have enough money in our capital markets to chase all the opportunities. So I'm actually not sure what we're talking about when we say over-regulating is going to slow us down. I think we're nowhere near that. And all the state laws that have been recently passed add up to like this much. So I don't think we're anywhere near it. I want innovation too. I want all of the good outcomes when we talk about the bio-design tools and what that could mean for health. That's a big deal. I want that. Do I want weather forecasting that can help save lives from natural disasters? Of course I do. And from everything I can tell, we're so far from over-regulating, but also the kinds of regulations we're talking about might actually help us innovate better and faster. I have an old boss that used to talk about the development of cars and how brakes don't actually slow down the development of automobiles. They enable you to go faster, right? Like that's the purpose of the exercise. And so that's where I tend to think about, which regulations are we actually concerned about? If we talk about the transparency example where states have multiple different transparency regimes, maybe that means a company has to hire an additional person to write the transparency reports. Maybe. Again, I read those laws and I don't think they're that onerous. I've been at companies, I don't buy that, but maybe let's take the good faith interpretation. If that's the case, do we think that additional hire is slowing down innovation at the point at which the benefits of transparency are outweighing that cost? Again, I don't think we're at that societal math even being close, but I think it's a thing we can debate, right? We can talk about what are the trade-offs involved. But that's where I don't see that happening. The other thing I think gets conflated is the U.S.-China race. Um, we are the two powers that have any real leading edge on this technology. There are a lot of ways to influence that race. The thing I, as a citizen and as a stakeholder of the United States, the thing that I want is the best use cases of that technology that are deployed in a way that make the lives of Americans better. That's the outcome I want, and I hope that's shared and easily agreeable. That's not the same as trying to slow down development in China or think about a bunch of different. If we're worried about the national security implications of AI, we should talk about which ones. Are we worried about the PLA using chatbots in military strategy exercises? Or are we worried about the AI that goes into actual technologically developed and guided weapons? That's a different question because those things are not chatbots, right? So that's where my mind goes to, like, what are we talking about? And I think there's some hand waving that brings all this together to go back one beat in our conversation to AGI, right? Like once you get to AGI, none of those distinctions matter. And I'm not convinced that is a thing.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, look, one of the biggest risks that have been brought up on the show have really been from AI ethicists. And they talk about how, whoa, the Industrial Revolution took blue collar jobs, but AI has taken white collar jobs, right? And predictions of, without intervention, of course, of 15% unemployment, bigger. Now, obviously, look, government acts when there's a crisis. If we hit even 10% unemployment, that's a crisis.
Sure.
And government's going to start figuring out what to do. But unchecked, it is clearly a scenario, or one of many scenarios, is the high unemployment, socioeconomic disruption, and just the massive, need to retrain millions of people. There will almost certainly be new jobs created by AI as well. Like, I just can't wait for the new AI psychologist job to open up. But obviously, between now and then, so how should we be thinking about AI risk management frameworks that explicitly incorporate labor market disruption, inequality, and financial instability?
Yeah. So let's start with what we know. The research, the like prognosticating and the research are both ambivalent, right? So what's happening today and what we might see run in many different directions. So it's a good question because I spent the morning looking at exactly this question of what's going on right now. The Yale Budget Lab put out a report, I think it's 2 months ago now, that we're actually not seeing a bunch of labor disruptions show up in the economic and labor data. And we've seen Stanford put out a report that shows that, I think they called it canaries in the coal mine, where if you look at early career in specific AI impacted job categories, you're starting to see declines at the rate of 13%, which is in a narrow space. But to your point, that's a big shift. That's not a small thing. In that kind of way, my answer becomes, I have a thought on what might happen, but that prediction has huge error bounds on either side of it, right? It could be rounding to nothing, as I think Jensen Huang thinks there's just going to be more AI jobs. We've seen that with everything. I think Dario over at Anthropic has talked about the 50% number that you pointed to. My best guess is that we will see it, and it'll be really, really meaningful in specific job categories. It won't happen overnight. There won't be a point at which we do it. And we'll have real attribution problems in figuring out what the technology caused, what we said the technology caused, because there might be other reasons from unemployment or laying people off that the people doing the layoffs may want to point to AI because it's an exogenous, you can't control it kind of thing. So I don't know how it's going to happen. Do I think there will be job loss? Yeah, I do. And there's early qualitative evidence that says it. The responses, the policy responses in my mind, to me, look more like traditional responses rather than coming up with some kind of newfangled thing or the universal basic income set of responses that we see out there. I personally think UBI is super interesting for a lot of reasons. not as a response to mass unemployment. Unemployment insurance is actually a reasonable policy solution. There was a report that the Hamilton Project and Brookings put out that looked at all the empirical studies of unemployment insurance as a response to COVID. During COVID, Congress expanded unemployment insurance, both who's eligible, the number of weeks anyone's eligible, the amount of money you get. And so they looked at, what did that do? Did that actually discourage working? And the answer is the disincentive to work was actually pretty small relative to other crashes in the past. There were real administrative headaches that actually slowed things down, that actually cost money. So to me, that's an answer. The other answer probably looks like a jobs program. The Workers' Progress Administration during the New Deal that thought about, the New Deal was a response to the Great Depression. We had a bunch of unemployed people and we figured out jobs. Where I think this public policy issue is most acute, not most like problematic, but where the policy issue is coders. Software developers are maybe the least sympathetic for a lot of reasons, both because you're generally highly paid, because I think a lot of people, if there is a crash, will blame them for the crash. But to me, most of the software developers were not actually AI developers, right? They're doing day-to-day coding. And for like a decade, maybe more, public policy leaders, government leaders have been telling parents, teach your kids how to code. Make sure you know how to code. That's a way to a job. So that to me becomes especially kind of, we have something of a moral responsibility to deal with it. But if we deal with it, I hope we don't just deal with coding. I hope we deal with the whole set of job losses that are going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And look, as we start seeing, and we already are, public sector adoption of Gen AI, whether it's the military or other agencies, look, there are very clear deployment risks, right? Like, and a lot of this is going to be really opaque to anyone outside of those agencies or our government. So what unique risks arise when AI systems are deployed in public sector decision making, so benefits administration, national security, and maybe can academic research or institutions such as yourselves like help inform mitigation strategies there?
On the second one, definitely yes. We certainly need a lot of input on this. So a few things. One, I'll agree with your premise, but I think it's worth stating that when a technology is used by the public sector, there is a heightened responsibility for transparency and for pre-deployment testing. So this is one where we go from the general to the specific. I worry less, but that's certainly far from zero, about the, name your employee of the department or agency that's using ChatGPT to summarize a paper that they're reading. That's not the use case I'm worried about. In the use case that are rights or safety impacting, which are terms that have actually been defined, and we've done a lot of work to say, what is that across agencies? That's where you actually need to test it for the use case that you're proposing it be used for before it's deployed. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is part of the White House and has a lot of cross-government responsibilities, including for IT, put out a memorandum in the last administration and a similar one in this administration that talks about what's needed there. There's a similar analog that's a national security memorandum that talks about that in the national security context. In both cases, I think about this as, you want the good. I do want NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to think about weather models that are enabled by AI that can be more granular and more accurate. That's a great thing to do. But that's really, really different than the person who is at NOAA who uses ChatGPT for a one-off task. Those are unrelated worlds almost, even though they're linked by something called AI, right? So that's where my mind goes to. Getting a weather prediction wrong actually has life and death implications because people rely on that on whether to evacuate for a natural disaster. That is very different, right? Like that's a whole set of different, do we test it? How do we think about this? What's the trust architecture? Does the local weather person on the news trust that still, right? Like there's a whole set of questions you have to get down to. It's even more stark in health and in finance and in so many different domains, but that's where the testing has to be done. And I think we actually have reasonable frameworks through OMB to think about these questions.
Yeah, that's great. Important to know. Yeah, I mean, I think there is stuff going on that's not transparent right now, at least
Totally.
to the American people, for sure.
Can I add one other thing there? The other thing I worry about is right now the research is a lot of corporations have adopted AI and have started to say, wait, I'm seeing limited ROI. And some of them will keep playing with it, try a different solution, or decide that that's not the solution for them because it's a cost and there's a return that they have to figure out. That's how the market works. And that'll push companies to do better. All of that will happen. The thing I do worry about is government signing a long-term contract that locks the government into a technology that we realize later isn't actually all it's set out to be, or it's not worth the amount we paid for it. So that's the thing I do worry quite a bit about. But I agree 100% that we're far from the level of transparency we need.
So in terms of accountability and liability, how should responsibility and liability for AI-induced harms be allocated among developers, deployers, regulators within a coherent risk management framework? And take it a step further, as an example, let's say I have an AI agent that does shopping for me. I give the agent $50 and say, go buy some sneakers, and it spends 110, right? Like, well, whose fault is that? Now, that's a very small example, but obviously these examples could apply to very big things like companies trading stocks or all kinds of credit decisions or things or for obviously the government level, that's that they could be levered down.
So first, I do think we have to be really thoughtful about defining where liability rests and not allowing our indecision to mean it rests nowhere. So in regulated context, so in the banking context, as a general matter, banks are responsible for which vendors are using, making sure their contracts reflect certain kinds of liability, all of the stuff that they have to do there. That's reasonable for banks to have to continue to do that. That will have an indirect implication on the kind of AI that they buy. Well, it'll have a direct implication on what they buy, but on the development of the tools and the ecosystem that allows for and wants to sell into banks. We're already seeing OpenAI and Anthropic hire people that are looking at specifically selling into those verticals. So we're going to see all of that happen, right? We're going to see a lot of the models and the companies start to develop compliant versions or pre-tested. That's a development that'll just kind of happen. In your example of the like, hey, I only said this was okay for $50 and it's $110 instead. That's one where we might have generalized product liability that courts can adjudicate over time. The things I worry about are, one, the implications of Section 230, which is a law from 1996 that generally says that an intermediary is not responsible for user. It started with speech, but it's been applied in broader context. I worry about it, that kind of a use case. I'm willing to bet a good amount of money that some company will try that defense somewhere. I just hope it doesn't stand. The other things I worry about are, one, the kinds of harms being that $50 to $110 example. That $60 harm might not be worth it it's almost certainly not worth it for you to sue. And if you add that up over a lot of people, that's actually a huge harm. And so that I worry about being a kind of real issue. And that's one where we actually do need laws to help figure that out. The other one I worry about is a lot of these terms of service that you check a box and you agree to a whole set of things, sometimes including the fact that you can't sue and that you have to go to arbitration. I think that those kinds of provisions have had huge harms. And I think we have to be really, really direct about the fact that in a society where we do allow technology to keep going forward at this pace without a bunch of rigorous testing before its launch, which is where we are now, you do need to be able to be made whole when there are harms. And if a limitation to that is you can't sue or you have to go through an arbitration clause or you can't do class actions that would help with the $60 problem, those are real concerns.
Yeah, totally. So there are many countries, obviously, working on AI. Every country wants it. I'm on the executive board of the Global AI Ethics Institute, and we think a lot about, country disparity and things like that. But if you think about here and other democracies and democratic legitimacy and trust, like what mechanisms are most effective for ensuring transparency and public trust in AI risk management regimes, particularly in democratic governance systems?
So I think you have to start from a standpoint of requirements of not just transparency, but actual dealing with harms and liability. You have to start with regimes that have real enforcement. So we talked earlier about you could pass a law that these things are required. Who enforces those? And if you don't have enough people at the enforcement agency that have a computer science degree, for example, or know what to look for, that creates a different kind of problem. So all of those, to me, are part of any system in a democracy, in a republic that claims to represent the people and their needs, for that to be effective and legitimate. Right now, you look at the polling, a lot of people are really worried about AI, and they're worried almost separately about a set of things that I think of as AI policy, but not everybody does. So like the protests that are going on for data centers, a lot of people link that to AI, and there's a traceability problem of, is that an AI policy problem that the people who think about AI policy should be discussing in the same way? A lot of people think about the non-consensual images that we talked about earlier, the deepfake nudes. That to me is an AI problem. But I think for a lot of people, it's just a really bad person did a really bad thing problem and a criminal problem. It is that, but it is also a technology problem. And when we don't see that, it's harder to get to a systems level solution. And so to me, all of these things add up to it. The bad faith conversations that sometimes happen and are increasingly happening about the overregulation or the 50 different patchwork, which we're not seeing that, right? We're not actually seeing 50 different really bad laws that differ. That also adds to it, right? I think you look at the polling on the moratorium and people hate that. People hate the idea that companies should get some kind of pass and that generalized laws passed by their representatives that they voted on should just get swept away, right? Like people don't like that.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, as you think about your future research agenda at the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator, what gaps do you see out there that you think need to be filled that you want to focus on?
I wish we were starting from gaps. I think we're starting from, there's so few regulations that like, what are the biggest areas that we need to get into? I tend to focus on a few areas. One is if you think about AI as a technological stack that starts with chips in cloud computing data centers that are running models that get used in all types of applications. Everything below application has a lot of the characteristics of what we traditionally think of as a utility. It's a means to an end. It's a concentrated industry, high barrier to entry. And so thinking about which kinds of utility style regulation makes sense, I'm not in the let's throw everything at it. I'm in the what makes sense where, right? So I put out a paper on cloud computing that said, here's 3 economic style regulations and here's 3 national security style regulations that match specific problems we're seeing in this industry. So to me, that's kind of one part of it that deals a lot with these are concentrated industries, right? 2/3 of the cloud market is 3 companies. If you look at foundation models, it's even higher. It's almost 90% is 3 companies, Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google, when measured as API revenues, right? When they're being used externally. Chips, it's even worse. NVIDIA has like 90% of the AI accelerator market. Google's making a play there too. But so all of those are real problems to me where we have a well understood set of frameworks on how to think about the policy responses that start from the railroads, move into telecom and banking. We have 150 years of experience with what works, what doesn't, how should we apply these things? And then I think about at the applications layer, we should be looking at the discrete problems and thinking about one step below that, broader solutions like liability, like testing regimes, that I don't think it's an or, it's kind of a we're going to have to do some mix of these things, and it's not all going to happen at once. It's going to have to happen over time.
Are there any other risk management frameworks that we haven't mentioned here today?
NIST has the AI risk management framework, the RMF. That to me was a useful document when it was passed because it told organizations how to begin to think about these questions, right? So it's not a prescriptive set of risks to manage or how to manage things, but what's the kinds of things you should think about? It's very high level, really good work when it came out, but we've evolved quite a bit. I'm not convinced there will be an answer, but there will be a bunch of domain-specific or use-specific answers, and that's where everybody's starting to develop their own, including financial regulators, including health regulators, everybody else. That's great. That should be done. We as civil society, you as a market participant, everybody should be part of that process, but we shouldn't let the process slow down to nothingness.
Yeah, that makes sense. And anything we haven't talked about today that you wanted to mention about AI risk management or policy or?
One of the other things I worry about is we talked a little bit about how we're starting to see evidence that businesses who invested in generative AI for their internal use are starting to question if those are worth the ROI. And again, to me, that's mostly a market question of how companies improve their product. People decide what to buy. What I worry about is if the business model doesn't appear in a reasonable time frame, it creates an incentive to find other business models where right now, generally, people spend money on buying a generative AI tool, whether that's a company or an individual. Once we start to go to other business models, which is the path we saw with search engines and social media, they found surveillance advertising. We're starting to see an increase in other surveillance-like business models, including surveillance pricing and wages. We're seeing workplace surveillance show up in a lot of ways that all using AI technologies, not generative AI, but cousins of that same technology, that can be really extractive and harmful. And so I worry about the degradation of the products we use. I think Cory Doctorow calls it enshittification. I think this is that process, right? When you reach a really indirect bad business model and regulators don't act quickly enough to say, this is an inherent harm that we don't like, that we all get caught in this where things get less and less useful, the products suck, we lose our privacy, it creates a whole bunch of societal harms. So I worry about that. I worry a little bit about the bubble conversation we're in, and are we investing too much at what time frame? I don't think it will appear into the kinds of harms I'm worried about in the coming year, but it may right after that, right? Who knows when this stuff happens?
Well, even taking a very popular chatbot and adding advertising could create pretty big problems for people, right? Like
totally.
They're, hey, give me the top 10 cars with the following features, and by the way, I care about 4-year-old used cars. And a year from now, you're getting an ad for a Chevy, right? Like that's a harm, right? Like
it's a harm, and there's a social contract issue because when we started using it, we didn't think the data would be used that way. And if they use all the chat history they've developed when people were, I'm not making a legal argument here, right? I'm making the hey, when I joined this wasn't really part of the agreement. And if all of a sudden you've used 2 years of chat history to target ads, which by the way is totally conceivable. This isn't it's not even hard to imagine this happening. In fact, there's good Twitter threads about how this is starting to happen in certain domains. And the chatbots are trying to be transparent about what's an ad and what's not, and mostly calling it test right now. But I don't know, that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, pretty bad. It makes your Google search history look like a joke, basically.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. It's been Asad Ramzanali, Director of AI and Tech Policy at the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Asad, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You are listening to the AI Risk Reward Podcast with your host, Alec Crawford. You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, for example, Apple Podcasts. Production and sound engineering by Troutman Street Audio. You can find them on LinkedIn. Please like, subscribe, and comment.